The early decades of the 20th century in America were a whirlwind of change, turmoil, and opportunity. From the rapid industrialization that drew immigrants from every corner of the globe, to the tightening grip of moral reformers seeking to reshape the nation's social fabric, the United States in the 1920s was a land of contradictions. It was against this backdrop that one of history's most infamous criminals, Alphonse Gabriel Al Capone, rose from the tenements of Brooklyn to the heights of power in Chicago. To understand Capone's story, one must first understand the America that created him. The ratification of the 18th Amendment in 1920 ushered in the era of Prohibition, an ambitious and controversial social experiment designed to eradicate alcohol from the American landscape. Reformers saw it as a moral triumph that would strengthen families and reduce crime. Instead, it opened a Pandora's box of vice, corruption, and violence that reshaped the criminal underworld forever. Cities like Chicago became battlegrounds for control over the illegal liquor trade. Politicians, police officers, and businessmen found themselves entangled in a web of bribes, fear, and alliances. In this volatile world, Capone emerged as both a ruthless gangster and a master strategist. He was more than a criminal. He was a product of his environment, a symbol of the opportunities and dangers of a society in flux. This essay will explore in exacting detail the life and legacy of Al Capone, from his humble beginnings as the son of Italian immigrants to his meteoric rise as the face of organized crime, and finally to his dramatic fall and eventual death. We will examine the cultural, social, and political currents that allowed a man like Capone to thrive, and we will reflect on how his story continues to shape modern perceptions of crime, celebrity, and power. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on January 17, 1899, in the tough, working-class neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York. The son of Italian immigrants, Gabriele and Teresa Capone, Al was one of 9 children in a large, close-knit family. His father, Gabriele, was a humble barber who had emigrated from Angri, a small town near Naples in search of the American dream. His mother, Teresa, was a seamstress who kept the family together through the hardships of immigrant life. The Capones settled in a world that was both vibrant and unforgiving. Brooklyn at the turn of the century was a place of stark contrasts, teeming with opportunity but riddled with poverty, ethnic tensions, and crime. Immigrant families like the Capones often found themselves struggling to make ends meet, while facing discrimination from established communities. For young Al, this environment provided both the hardships that would harden him and the opportunities that would propel him toward infamy. Growing up in such a volatile environment shaped Al's worldview. He was an intelligent boy, quick to learn and eager to adapt, but the streets taught lessons that schoolbooks could not. He attended Catholic school in Brooklyn, but dropped out by the 6th grade after striking a teacher during a heated confrontation. This act of defiance marked the beginning of his permanent break from formal education, but not from learning. The streets of Brooklyn became his classroom, where survival depended on observation, cunning, and at times brute force. Young Al quickly realized that strength, loyalty, and reputation were everything. The streets were controlled by gangs, and for many boys in the neighborhood, joining these groups was less a choice and more a means of survival. By his early teens, Capone had started running errands for small-time gangsters, learning the basics of hustling, intimidation, and loyalty that would later define his career. The Capone family, like many immigrant families, dreamed of assimilation and upward mobility. They wanted their children to succeed, to rise above the prejudice that labeled Italians as second-class citizens. Yet the opportunities for advancement were slim, and many young men found themselves drawn into the underworld, not simply out of greed, but out of necessity. Al Capone grew up surrounded by stories of men who had turned to illicit activities as a way to escape poverty, and these narratives undoubtedly shaped his ambitions. Moreover, Capone's Italian heritage instilled in him a strong sense of family loyalty and community ties. These values, while noble in many ways, would also bind him tightly to the world of organized crime, where loyalty to one's crew often superseded the law of the land. By his mid-teens, Capone was already showing promise as a street-smart hustler. His natural charisma, combined with an intimidating physical presence, made him a valuable recruit for local gangs. One of his earliest connections was with Johnny Torrio, a seasoned gangster who would later become a pivotal figure in Capone's rise. Torrio recognized in Al a rare blend of intelligence, ambition, and ruthlessness, qualities that, when honed, could make him a formidable player in the criminal world. Capone also worked briefly for Frankie Yale, a notorious Brooklyn gangster who ran the Harvard Inn, a saloon and dance hall frequented by toughs and criminals. It was during his time working for Yale that Al acquired the nickname Scarface. A heated argument with a rival in the saloon led to a violent altercation, leaving Capone with 3 prominent scars across his left cheek. Though he hated the nickname, the scars became part of his persona, signaling to others that he was not a man to be underestimated. These early years were formative, providing Capone with a practical education in strategy, loyalty, and the importance of reputation. He learned that fear could be as effective as respect, and that both were essential tools for survival and dominance. He also understood the value of relationships, not just with fellow criminals, but with politicians, police, and businessmen who could be bribed, influenced, or intimidated. By the time he reached his early 20s, Al Capone was no longer just another street kid from Brooklyn. He had developed the sharp instincts and ruthless pragmatism that would allow him to navigate the treacherous world of organized crime. And soon, he would take those lessons to Chicago, where his empire would begin to take shape. Al Capone's ascent from the rough streets of Brooklyn to the throne of organized crime in Chicago did not happen overnight. It was a gradual, calculated climb, fueled by a keen understanding of power dynamics, an ability to build strategic alliances, and an almost preternatural instinct for business. By the time he turned 20, Capone had learned enough from his mentors in New York to recognize that true success in the criminal world required more than brute force. It required vision, patience, and the ability to seize opportunity when it came. Capone's opportunity arrived through his connection with Johnny Torrio, the man who had quietly mentored him during his formative years in New York. Torrio had moved to Chicago in the early 1910s to help manage operations for James Big Jim Colosimo, a prominent figure in the city's underworld. By 1919, Torrio invited Capone to join him in Chicago, offering him a position within Colosimo's organization. For Capone, the decision was easy. Chicago represented new horizons, a booming city teeming with industry, wealth, and most importantly, opportunities for organized crime. The city was in the midst of a rapid transformation, with prohibition on the horizon and an ever-growing demand for alcohol. Capone accepted Torrio's invitation and made his way west, leaving behind the familiar streets of Brooklyn for the unknown but promising world of Chicago. Under Torrio's guidance, Capone quickly adapted to the unique dynamics of Chicago's criminal landscape. Unlike New York, which was crowded with established gangs, Chicago offered a relatively open playing field. Torrio, an astute businessman as well as a shrewd gangster, valued discretion and efficiency over unnecessary violence. Lessons Capone absorbed quickly. Initially, Capone worked in smaller roles, managing brothels and assisting in the logistics of gambling operations. His natural charisma made him an effective negotiator, while his imposing physical presence ensured that he could handle trouble when it arose. Over time, Capone earned Torrio's trust and began handling more significant aspects of the organization's operations. The ratification of the 18th Amendment in 1920 and the subsequent enforcement of the Volstead Act changed everything. Prohibition, intended to curb crime and improve morality, had the opposite effect in cities like Chicago. The sudden illegality of alcohol created a massive black market, and with it, unprecedented opportunities for profit. Torrio recognized this shift immediately and began moving the organization toward large-scale bootlegging. Speakeasies sprang up across the city, and the demand for alcohol skyrocketed. Capone, with his sharp business instincts, proved invaluable in expanding operations, coordinating shipments and managing a growing network of suppliers and distributors. It was during this period that Capone began to cultivate a reputation not just as a ruthless enforcer, but as a savvy businessman. He understood that violence had its place, but that true power came from controlling supply chains, managing relationships, and keeping the wheels of commerce turning smoothly. As Capone's responsibilities grew, so too did his influence within Chicago's underworld. He developed a reputation for loyalty, competence, and controlled aggression. Unlike some gangsters who reveled in chaos, Capone understood the importance of maintaining a balance between fear and respect. He treated his men well, paid them generously, and ensured that those who crossed him were dealt with swiftly and decisively. Capone's rise was not without conflict. Rival gangs, particularly those led by Irish and Polish factions, viewed the Italian syndicates as threats to their territories. Street battles were common, and Capone quickly proved himself in these confrontations, earning the respect of his peers and the fear of his enemies. By 1920, tensions within the organization reached a boiling point. Big Jim Colosimo, the original boss of the Chicago operation, was hesitant to fully embrace the bootlegging business, fearing the attention it would bring from law enforcement. Torrio, however, saw prohibition as the key to exponential growth. When Colosimo refused to adapt, Torrio made a bold move. In May of 1920, Colosimo was murdered in his restaurant, a crime that remains unsolved but is widely believed to have been orchestrated by Torrio, with Capone possibly playing a role. With Colosimo out of the way, Torrio assumed full control of the operation, and Capone became his trusted lieutenant. This event marked a significant turning point in Capone's life. No longer just an ambitious young gangster, he was now at the center of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country. With Torrio's mentorship and the opportunities afforded by Prohibition, Capone was poised to rise even higher. By the early 1920s, Al Capone had firmly established himself as a rising star in the underworld. His combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and charisma set him apart from his peers. He was not merely a gangster, he was a strategist, capable of seeing the bigger picture and positioning himself for long-term success. The stage was set for Capone's transformation from Torrio's protégé into the undisputed king of Chicago's criminal empire. The city, with its booming economy, corrupt officials, and insatiable thirst for illegal alcohol, was ready for a man of Capone's ambition, and he was ready to seize the moment. The dawn of Prohibition in January 1920 was a turning point in American history, reshaping social habits, political alliances, and the criminal landscape of nearly every city. For Al Capone and his associates, it was the spark that ignited an empire. What reformers had intended as a moral victory became instead a business opportunity of unprecedented scale, and Capone was quick to seize it. When the Volstead Act made the manufacture, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages illegal, it did little to diminish demand. Americans from all walks of life still wanted to drink, and they were willing to pay for the privilege. This sudden vacuum in the market created fertile ground for organized crime to flourish, and Chicago quickly became the epicenter of the illicit liquor trade. Working closely with Johnny Torrio, Capone helped orchestrate a sophisticated bootlegging network that would supply speakeasies, clubs, and private buyers across the city. The operation ran with near-military precision. Brewers and distillers produced the alcohol, couriers transported it under the cover of night, and Capone's men ensured that police and politicians were well paid to look the other way. By leveraging his natural charm and business savvy, Capone expanded operations beyond simple sales, forging relationships with out-of-state suppliers and organizing distribution routes that stretched across state lines. In less than 2 years, bootlegging had transformed from a sideline hustle into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Capone understood that success required more than muscle. It required innovation. Under his guidance, the Chicago outfit diversified its operations. In addition to bootlegging, the gang expanded into gambling, prostitution, and protection rackets, creating multiple streams of revenue that reinforced their financial and territorial dominance. Capone's approach to business was almost corporate in nature. He maintained detailed financial records, tracked profits meticulously, and rewarded loyalty with generous pay. To the men who worked for him, Capone was more than a boss. He was a provider, someone who ensured their families were fed and protected. One of the most visible legacies of Prohibition was the rise of the speakeasy, hidden bars and nightclubs where people could drink, dance, and socialize away from the prying eyes of the law. By the mid-1920s, Thousands of these establishments dotted Chicago, and many of them relied on Capone's organization for their supply of alcohol. This new nightlife culture blurred the lines between legality and criminality. Politicians, businessmen, and even law enforcement officials frequented speakeasies, often rubbing shoulders with the very gangsters they publicly condemned. For Capone, this was more than just good business. It was a way to build social capital and strengthen his grip on the city. With wealth and influence came inevitable conflict. Rival gangs, such as the Irish-controlled North Side Gang, led by Dean O'Banion, sought their share of the lucrative bootlegging market. The competition quickly turned violent, with shootings, bombings, and ambushes becoming commonplace on the streets of Chicago. Capone, though ruthless when necessary, preferred negotiation to open warfare. He struck deals when he could, but when diplomacy failed, violence was swift and decisive. These clashes would eventually escalate into some of the most notorious gang wars in American history, setting the stage for events like the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Despite the violence that surrounded his operations, Capone cultivated a carefully managed public image. He presented himself as a man of the people, a benefactor who donated to charities, provided free milk to children, and handed out food to the poor during the harsh winters of the Great Depression. Newspapers, hungry for sensational stories, amplified this persona. Capone's name became synonymous with the glamour and danger of the Roaring Twenties. He was not just a criminal, he was a celebrity, a figure whose exploits captivated a nation and whose influence seemed to stretch beyond the confines of Chicago. Key to Capone's dominance was his control of local authorities. Bribes flowed freely to police officers, city officials, and judges, ensuring that raids were tipped off in advance and arrests rarely led to convictions. This systemic corruption allowed Capone's empire to operate with near impunity for much of the 1920s. Yet this same visibility also made him a target. Federal authorities, increasingly frustrated with the blatant lawlessness in Chicago, began to take a closer look at Capone and his operations. The stage was set for an inevitable confrontation, one that would pit the most notorious gangster in America against the full force of the law. By the mid-1920s, the criminal organization that would come to be known as the Chicago Outfit was no longer a loose collection of gangs. It was a sophisticated, hierarchical enterprise. Under the strategic leadership of Johnny Torrio and the rising influence of Al Capone, the outfit transformed into one of the most powerful and profitable criminal syndicates in the nation. It was an empire built on bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and political corruption, and at its heart was a keen understanding of business principles that rivaled those of legitimate corporations. The Chicago outfit was organized with military-like precision. At the top sat Torrio, the mastermind who preferred diplomacy to chaos, and just below him was Capone, his trusted lieutenant and eventual successor. Beneath them were lieutenants and capos, who managed specific territories and operations, each commanding crews of soldiers and enforcers tasked with maintaining order and protecting revenue streams. This structure allowed the outfit to expand rapidly while maintaining discipline. Territories were carefully divided to minimize internal disputes, and profits were shared in a way that incentivized loyalty. Capone understood that in an underworld where betrayal was common, trust and loyalty were commodities as valuable as money. As Prohibition deepened, the outfit's reach expanded far beyond Chicago's borders. They controlled breweries and distilleries, not only within the city, but in nearby states, establishing a distribution network that spanned the Midwest. Alcohol was smuggled in from Canada via Lake Michigan, transported across state lines in hidden compartments, and distributed to a growing number of speakeasies and nightclubs. The revenue was staggering. By some estimates, the outfit was earning more than $60 million a year at the height of its operations, a fortune that allowed Capone to live lavishly while reinvesting in his criminal enterprises. Although Torrio had taught Capone the value of discretion, violence remained an indispensable part of maintaining power. The outfit faced constant challenges from rival gangs, most notably the North Side Gang, led first by Dean O'Banion and later by Jaime Weiss and Bugs Moran. Each attempt to encroach on the outfit's territory was met with decisive retaliation. Drive-by shootings, bombings, and ambushes became regular occurrences, turning the streets of Chicago into open battlegrounds. Capone, however, understood that violence was most effective when it was calculated, not reckless. Targets were chosen carefully, and messages were delivered with brutal clarity: cross the outfit, and there would be consequences. In 1925, after surviving an assassination attempt orchestrated by rival gangs, Johnny Torrio decided it was time to step back from the daily grind of organized crime. He handed the reins of the outfit to his protégé, Al Capone, who was just 26 years old at the time. With Torrio's retirement, Capone stepped fully into the spotlight. Unlike Torrio, who preferred to operate quietly, Capone embraced the public eye. He moved into a luxurious suite at the Metropole Hotel, drove flashy cars, and wore custom-tailored suits that signaled both power and wealth. This newfound visibility cemented his status as the face of organized crime in America. Capone's leadership of the outfit was a study in contrasts. On one hand, he was ruthless, willing to eliminate anyone who threatened his authority. On the other, he was generous to those within his circle, rewarding loyalty with money, protection, and opportunities. This dual approach earned him fierce devotion from his men and grudging respect from rivals. Even law enforcement officials, many of whom were on his payroll, acknowledged his ability to balance charisma with calculated brutality. Capone understood that fear alone could not sustain an empire. It had to be tempered with incentives that bound people to him. As Capone's power grew, so did his legend. Newspapers, captivated by the drama of gangland Chicago, chronicled his every move. To the public, Capone became a paradoxical figure, a ruthless gangster who also donated to charities, funded soup kitchens during the Great Depression, and provided jobs in neighborhoods neglected by the city. This Robin Hood image, carefully cultivated, allowed Capone to maintain a level of public support that frustrated law enforcement. To many struggling families, he wasn't just a criminal. He was a provider, someone who had beaten the system and shared the spoils with those who had nothing. Yet, for all the power and wealth the outfit commanded, its success came at a price. The violence that accompanied territorial disputes drew national attention, and the federal government began to see Chicago as a symbol of the lawlessness that Prohibition had unleashed. Reformers and journalists called for action, and law enforcement agencies, local and federal alike, began to coordinate efforts to dismantle Capone's empire. The stage was set for a collision between Capone and the forces of law, one that would ultimately determine the fate of both the man and the organization he built. By the time Al Capone assumed full control of the Chicago outfit in 1925, he had become more than a crime boss. He was a household name. In the eyes of many Americans, Capone was the personification of the Roaring Twenties: sharp suits, luxury cars, endless cash, and the swagger of someone who seemed untouchable. But behind this carefully crafted public image lay a far more complex and ruthless reality. Capone understood better than most the power of perception. Long before the age of social media, he was a master of public relations. He cultivated relationships with reporters, granting interviews and dropping memorable sound bites that painted him as a businessman rather than a gangster. He famously described himself as a public benefactor, once stating, "I'm just a businessman giving the people what they want." To the average Chicagoan, struggling during the economic boom and later during the onset of the Great Depression, this narrative resonated. Capone wasn't just a criminal, he was a man who provided jobs, ran soup kitchens, and handed out cash to struggling families. Capone's charitable acts were real, but they were also strategic. During the harsh winter of 1929, his soup kitchens fed thousands of unemployed and hungry Chicagoans. He made highly visible donations to local charities and supported community events, ensuring that his name was associated with generosity as much as with violence. This generosity, however, came with strings attached. For many in the neighborhoods under his control, Capone's kindness was a reminder of his influence, a subtle reinforcement of loyalty and silence. His philanthropy blurred the lines between goodwill and intimidation, creating a paradoxical image. A man feared by rivals, but loved by those who benefited from his largesse. Behind the polished image, Capone's world was one of calculated brutality. Violence wasn't just a tool, it was a language, one he used fluently to maintain order and eliminate threats. Rival gangsters were gunned down in broad daylight, businesses that resisted his protection rackets were bombed, and political opponents found themselves coerced, blackmailed, or worse. The streets of Chicago became a theater of war, with Capone directing the performance from behind the scenes. For those inside the outfit, loyalty was paramount, but so was fear. Capone was known to reward devotion with wealth and security, but betrayal was met with swift and merciless punishment. This balance of fear and favor kept his empire running smoothly, even as the violence escalated. The press could not look away. Capone's flamboyance, his charisma, and his unapologetic lifestyle made him irresistible to reporters and the public alike. Headlines chronicled his every move, his tailored suits, his lavish parties, his $40,000 bulletproof Cadillac. Ironically, the very visibility that made Capone a celebrity also painted a target on his back. Federal authorities, increasingly embarrassed by their inability to curb organized crime, began focusing their efforts squarely on him. His growing notoriety transformed him from a local crime boss into a national figure and the most wanted man in America. Capone's public persona provided short-term protection, but carried long-term consequences. As his empire grew, so did the scrutiny. Journalists began digging deeper, publishing exposés that detailed his involvement in violent crimes and widespread corruption. Civic reformers called for action, and even some within Chicago's political machine began to view Capone as a liability rather than an asset. The reality was clear. The same public image that had once shielded him was now accelerating his downfall. The more visible Capone became, the harder it was to operate in the shadows, and in organized crime, visibility is often fatal. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Capone's legacy is this contradiction. A man who could smile for the cameras, hand out turkeys at Thanksgiving, and joke with reporters, while simultaneously ordering assassinations, running a sprawling criminal empire, and corrupting entire swathes of law enforcement and city government. He was both a product of his environment and a shaper of it. The same streets that had taught him the rules of survival had now elevated him to unprecedented heights. But those same lessons, built on violence, control, and intimidation, ensured that his reign would not last forever. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which took place on February 14, 1929, remains one of the most infamous episodes in the history of organized crime. It was the day that the bloody turf war between Al Capone's Chicago outfit and the North Side Gang exploded in a burst of violence that would shock the nation, forever cementing Capone's name in the annals of American history. For years, tensions between Capone's outfit and the North Side Gang had been escalating. The roots of the feud dated back to the early 1920s, during the reign of Dean O'Banion, the North Side Gang's original leader. O'Banion's murder in 1924, allegedly orchestrated by Capone and Johnny Torrio, had set off a chain reaction of reprisals. After Torrio stepped back from leadership, Capone inherited not only the outfit, but also the bitter rivalries that came with it. By 1929, the outfit controlled the lion's share of the bootlegging market, but George Bugs Moran, O'Banion's successor, refused to bow to Capone. Moran's gang continued hijacking outfit liquor shipments, ambushing drivers, and chipping away at Capone's profits. The streets of Chicago were becoming a war zone, with drive-by shootings and bombings claiming dozens of lives on both sides. Capone, though in Florida at the time, allegedly approved a bold plan to cripple the North Side Gang once and for all. The strategy was simple: lure Moran and his top men into a trap and eliminate them in one swift, brutal strike. On the morning of February 14, 1929, 7 members of the North Side Gang gathered at a garage on North Clark Street, where they believed they were meeting to receive a shipment of high-quality Canadian whiskey. Instead, they were walking into an ambush meticulously planned by Capone's lieutenants, including Jack Machine Gun McGurn. Shortly after 10:30 a.m., witnesses reported seeing a police car pull up to the garage. 4 men entered, 2 dressed as uniformed police officers, the others in plain clothes. Believing they were being raided, Moran's men lined up obediently against a wall. Without warning, the gunman opened fire with Thompson's submachine guns and shotguns, unleashing a hail of bullets that left the garage a scene of carnage. 6 gangsters and 1 associate were killed in under a minute. Only Moran himself escaped, having arrived late and spotting the suspicious police car from a distance before fleeing. The brutality of the massacre was staggering. The victims were riddled with bullets, their bodies left in grotesque positions against the cold garage wall. Chicago, already desensitized to gangland killings, was stunned by the scale and precision of the violence. News of the massacre spread like wildfire. Photographs of the crime scene appeared in newspapers nationwide, shocking the public and turning Al Capone into the face of lawlessness in America. Although Capone was hundreds of miles away in Miami at the time, an alibi he made sure was well documented, few doubted that he had orchestrated the slaughter. Public opinion began to shift. Capone's carefully crafted image as a businessman and benefactor crumbled under the weight of the massacre's brutality. Editorials condemned him as a ruthless killer, and reformers intensified their calls for federal intervention in Chicago. The massacre dealt a devastating blow to the North Side gang. Although Bugs Moran survived, his organization never fully recovered from the loss of so many key men. Capone's outfit emerged as the dominant force in Chicago's underworld, consolidating control over the city's bootlegging operations. However, the victory came at a cost. The bloodshed galvanized law enforcement, prompting federal agencies to step up efforts to dismantle organized crime. For Capone, the massacre marked both the peak of his power and the beginning of his downfall. The St. Valentine's Day massacre was a public relations disaster for Capone. President Herbert Hoover, under pressure from the press and the public, ordered federal authorities to make Capone their top priority. The newly formed Bureau of Prohibition, along with the Treasury Department, began investigating his financial records, building the case that would eventually lead to his conviction for tax evasion. The massacre remains a defining moment in American criminal history. It exposed the dark reality of organized crime during Prohibition, a world where violence was a business tool and human life was expendable in the pursuit of power and profit. For Capone, the event was a paradox, a ruthless display of dominance that solidified his control but also painted a target on his back, accelerating the federal government's resolve to bring him down. By the late 1920s, Al Capone's reign over Chicago was absolute, but it was also unsustainable. The St. Valentine's Day massacre had transformed him from a celebrated outlaw into public enemy number 1. What had once been quiet grumbling among reformers, journalists, and federal agents erupted into a unified demand. Al Capone had to be stopped. The massacre ignited a wave of outrage that swept beyond Chicago. Newspapers across the country ran graphic images of the slain North Side gang members, and headlines condemned Capone as the architect of a city drenched in blood. Politicians, long content to look the other way, were now under intense public scrutiny to rein in organized crime. President Herbert Hoover, deeply concerned that the lawlessness in Chicago was eroding public confidence in government, personally ordered federal agencies to get Capone. The federal government, previously slow and disorganized in its efforts to tackle organized crime, now mobilized with unprecedented intensity. To combat Capone's growing empire, the Bureau of Prohibition assigned a young, ambitious agent named Elliot Ness to lead a team of investigators tasked with crippling the outfit's operations. Ness handpicked a group of incorruptible men, quickly dubbed the Untouchables by the press, who could not be bribed or intimidated. Ness and his team adopted aggressive, unconventional tactics. They raided breweries, intercepted shipments, and disrupted the financial infrastructure of Capone's empire. Though their actions had limited immediate financial impact, they earned Ness a reputation as a relentless adversary and signaled a turning point. Law enforcement was no longer playing Capone's game. While Ness made headlines with his raids, the real breakthrough came from a quieter, less glamorous angle. The Treasury Department's Special Intelligence Unit, led by Agent Frank J. Wilson, began meticulously investigating Capone's finances. For years, Capone had flaunted his wealth while avoiding formal employment or legitimate income records. He lived in lavish hotels, drove expensive cars, and hosted extravagant parties, all while claiming he had no taxable income. Wilson and his team scoured bank records, receipts, and ledgers, building a case that would prove devastating: tax evasion. The brilliance of this strategy lay in its simplicity. While Capone could intimidate witnesses or bribe local officials, tax law was federal and unforgiving. No one was above the Internal Revenue Service, and Capone's arrogance in flaunting his untaxed wealth provided investigators with all the ammunition they needed. As law enforcement pressure mounted, Capone became increasingly paranoid. He surrounded himself with bodyguards, traveled in bulletproof cars, and rarely appeared in public without a heavily armed entourage. Even within the outfit, trust began to erode, as Capone feared betrayal from rivals or ambitious underlings eager to take his place. Despite his efforts to project confidence, the walls were closing in. The raids disrupted revenue streams, the press vilified him, and federal agents were closing the financial noose. By 1931, it was clear that Capone's days as the untouchable king of Chicago were numbered. The growing pressure also eroded Capone's relationships with corrupt officials who had once shielded him. Politicians who had taken his bribes began to distance themselves, fearing association with a man increasingly seen as a liability. The lavish lifestyle that had once endeared him to the public now painted him as a symbol of unchecked greed and corruption. The city of Chicago, once a playground for Capone's empire, was becoming hostile territory. Even ordinary citizens, once grateful for his charity, began to see the violence and chaos that his empire had unleashed. By mid-1931, the Treasury Department had compiled a mountain of evidence showing that Capone had failed to pay taxes on millions of dollars in illegal income. In June of that year, a federal grand jury indicted him on 22 counts of income tax evasion, along with thousands of prohibition-related violations. The government had found its opening. Instead of trying to convict Capone on murder or racketeering charges, crimes that relied on terrified witnesses or corrupt systems, they would take him down with the quiet efficiency of the tax code. Throughout this period, the media continued to feed the public's fascination with Capone. Every raid, every arrest, every appearance in court was headline news. But the tone had changed. Where Capone had once been glamorized as a daring rogue, he was now portrayed as a dangerous criminal whose time was running out. This shift in perception further isolated him, eroding the aura of invincibility that had protected him for nearly a decade. By 1931, Al Capone had reached the zenith of his power and was already on the brink of his downfall. Years of unrelenting federal pressure, coupled with the shifting tides of public opinion, had turned the once celebrated Robin Hood of Chicago into the most wanted man in America. His empire still spanned the city's underworld, but the noose was tightening, and Capone's unchecked arrogance would hasten his fall. In June 1931, a federal grand jury handed down a sweeping indictment against Capone. The charges were not for murder, racketeering, or the bloody violence that had defined his reign, but for income tax evasion, a technical, almost anticlimactic offense compared to his other crimes. This approach was deliberate. Prosecutors, led by U.S. Attorney George E.Q. Johnson, understood that murder charges required witnesses willing to testify, something nearly impossible in a city paralyzed by fear of Capone's reach. Tax evasion, however, was different. It was clear, documented, and difficult to dispute. Capone, ever confident, initially dismissed the charges. He believed that his lawyers could negotiate a deal and that his wealth and influence could secure another escape from justice. But this time the government was determined, and the public was watching. Capone's trial began in October 1931 and quickly captured the nation's attention. The courtroom in downtown Chicago was packed daily with journalists, photographers, and spectators eager to witness the fall of the most notorious gangster in America. Prosecutors presented meticulous evidence of Capone's lavish lifestyle, his expensive suits, his private suites at luxury hotels, his extravagant parties, juxtaposed against his complete failure to report any taxable income. Receipts, ledgers, and witness testimony painted a picture of a man living in opulence, funded entirely by untaxed criminal profits. Capone's defense team, led by attorney Michael Ahern, attempted to argue that their client had no formal income, that his wealth was exaggerated, and that he was being unfairly targeted. But the evidence was overwhelming, and public sentiment had turned decisively against him. Capone, confident in his ability to manipulate the system, allegedly attempted to bribe and intimidate jurors. But the federal judge, James H. Wilkerson, anticipated such tactics. On the morning the trial was set to begin, Wilkerson quietly ordered the jury to be swapped with another panel from a separate courtroom. Capone, blindsided, was left with no leverage. This bold move ensured that the trial would proceed fairly, and for the first time, Capone faced a legal battle he could not rig in his favor. On October 17, 1931, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion. The sentence was severe: 11 years in federal prison, a $50,000 fine, and nearly $8,000 in court costs. At the time, it was one of the harshest sentences ever handed down for tax evasion, a clear message that no one, not even the king of Chicago's underworld, was above the law. Capone, stunned, attempted to maintain his composure as he was led away, but the reality was undeniable. His empire was collapsing. Capone began serving his sentence in 1932 at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, but his influence and wealth initially afforded him relative comfort. Reports circulated that he received special privileges, including a private cell and access to luxuries denied to other inmates. This leniency ended in 1934, when authorities, determined to break his hold, transferred him to the newly opened Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary in San Francisco Bay. Isolated from his network, surrounded by some of the country's most dangerous criminals, and under the constant watch of strict guards, Capone found himself truly powerless for the first time in his life. At Alcatraz, the man who had once ruled Chicago with an iron fist became inmate number 85, spending his days performing menial tasks and battling the onset of mental illness. Years of untreated syphilis, contracted in his youth, began to ravage Capone's mind and body. By the time he was released from prison in 1939, his mental capacity had deteriorated significantly. Medical evaluations described him as having the mental faculties of a 12-year-old child. The once feared gangster, who had commanded armies of men and orchestrated the flow of millions of dollars, now struggled to recognize old associates or comprehend the world that had moved on without him. While Capone languished in prison, the Chicago outfit adapted and thrived under new leadership. Men like Frank Nitti and Paul Ricca assumed control, steering the organization into new ventures while distancing themselves from the chaos and notoriety that had marked Capone's reign. By the time Capone returned to his Florida estate in Palm Island, his era had passed. The man who had once been the most powerful figure in organized crime was now a shadow of himself, a relic of a violent age that had already begun to fade into legend. By the time Al Capone walked out of prison in November 1939, the once mighty king of Chicago's underworld was a broken man. Physically weakened and mentally diminished by years of untreated syphilis, Capone returned to a world that had changed dramatically. His empire was gone, his reputation tarnished, and his ability to command respect or fear had all but vanished. Capone retreated to his luxurious estate on Palm Island, Florida, a sprawling mansion that had once been a symbol of his untouchable power. Now it served as a quiet refuge for a man whose mind was slipping further away from reality. Neighbors and visitors noted how different Capone had become. The sharp, calculating gangster was gone. In his place was a man who spent his days fishing, gardening, or listening to music, often playing his banjo for hours at a time. Conversations with him revealed a mind plagued by confusion. At times he struggled to recall the very empire that had made him infamous. Capone's battle with neurosyphilis, an advanced stage of syphilis that attacks the brain, accelerated in his final years. The disease eroded his memory, judgment, and motor skills, leaving him with the mental capacity of a child. Family members tried to shield him from the public eye, but occasional sightings only fueled public fascination. To the outside world, the once feared mob boss now appeared as a hollow shell of his former self, a living cautionary tale of the corrosive power of unchecked ambition and excess. In the early 1940s, as America plunged into World War II, Capone faded from the headlines. The newspapers that had once chronicled his every move now devoted their pages to global conflict, and the legend of Scarface became just another story from the past. Despite his decline, Capone's name still carried weight. Visitors, including former associates and curious onlookers, occasionally made their way to Palm Island. But these encounters often ended in quiet sadness, as they witnessed firsthand the frailty of the man who had once ruled Chicago with an iron fist. By 1946, Capone's health had deteriorated to the point that he required constant care. His family remained loyal, surrounding him with comfort and privacy during his final years. The man who had once orchestrated million-dollar bootlegging operations and violent territorial battles now spent his days in seclusion, far removed from the chaos and power struggles that had defined his youth. On January 21, 1947, Capone suffered a massive stroke. He briefly rallied but soon contracted pneumonia, and his weakened body could not recover. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone died at the age of 48. His funeral, though private, drew significant attention from the press. The man who had once been America's most notorious gangster was laid to rest in Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, alongside other members of his family. Capone's death marked the end of an era in organized crime. By the late 1940s, the face of the underworld had changed. Organized crime had become more corporate, more discreet, and less flamboyant. The lessons of Capone's rise and fall were not lost on the next generation of mob leaders, who understood that visibility was a liability and that true power thrived in the shadows. Even in death, Capone's legend only grew. Books, movies, and television shows immortalized him as the archetypal gangster, a man whose life embodied the excesses and contradictions of the Prohibition Era. To some, he was a ruthless criminal whose violence left a trail of blood across Chicago. To others, he remained a symbol of rebellion, a man who gamed the system and provided for the common people when legitimate institutions failed them. Few figures in American history have left as deep and enduring a mark as Al Capone. Decades after his death, his name remains synonymous with organized crime, prohibition, and the larger-than-life image of the gangster as both villain and anti-hero. Capone was not just a man, he was, and still is, a cultural phenomenon. Capone's life, filled with violence, wealth, and charisma, quickly transformed into legend. Newspapers of the 1920s and 1930s helped craft the myth, portraying him alternately as a ruthless killer and a benevolent kingpin. This duality, part monster, part folk hero, cemented his place in the American imagination. Hollywood embraced the legend early. The 1932 film Scarface, loosely based on Capone's life, turned him into an archetype, the ambitious outsider who rises to power only to be destroyed by the very violence that built his empire. Later films, television series, and even video games would recycle and romanticize this narrative, keeping Capone's story alive for generations. Before Capone, gangsters were largely shadowy figures, operating in the margins of public consciousness. Capone changed that. He became the face of organized crime, a figure whose flamboyance and openness redefined what it meant to be a gangster. He showed that crime could be run like a corporation, with hierarchies, territories, and revenue streams carefully managed like legitimate businesses. In doing so, Capone helped lay the groundwork for the modern American mob, influencing generations of organized crime leaders who would adopt his strategies, while avoiding his fatal mistake of courting public attention. Capone's appeal has always been rooted in contradiction. To many, he was a brutal criminal who left bodies in the streets of Chicago. Yet to others, especially in neighborhoods where he provided jobs, protection, or charity, he was a man of the people. This anti-hero image has made him an enduring cultural symbol. In literature, film, and music, Capone often appears not just as a villain, but as a complex figure, someone who embodies the darker side of the American dream, where ambition, ingenuity, and ruthlessness lead to both triumph and tragedy. Capone's story offers more than just spectacle. It is also a cautionary tale about power, corruption, and hubris. His rise exposed the unintended consequences of prohibition, a policy that criminalized a popular vice and created a lucrative black market for organized crime to exploit. His fall demonstrated that visibility and arrogance could be just as dangerous as rival bullets. Law enforcement also learned from the Capone era. The coordinated efforts of federal agencies, particularly the Treasury Department, set the stage for modern approaches to tackling organized crime. The case against Capone became a model for using financial and administrative laws to dismantle criminal organizations when traditional criminal prosecutions failed. Over the decades, Capone has appeared in countless cultural works, from classic gangster films to modern dramas. Notable examples include Scarface, 1932, directly inspired by his life. This film set the template for gangster cinema. Television series such as Boardwalk Empire, where Capone is depicted as a young, ambitious enforcer rising to power. Music and literature. Artists from rap icons to novelists have invoked Capone's name as a symbol of power, rebellion, and excess. Each portrayal has added to the myth, sometimes blurring the lines between history and fiction. The real Capone, a man of contradictions, capable of both generosity and unimaginable cruelty, is often overshadowed by the legend. Today, Al Capone remains a symbol of a uniquely American paradox, the blending of crime, capitalism, and celebrity. His story continues to resonate because it reflects enduring themes: ambition, the allure of wealth, the corrupting influence of power, and the inevitable price of hubris. Capone's name has become shorthand for organized crime, invoked whenever discussions of the mafia, gang violence, or Prohibition Era America arise. His life, a mixture of glamour and violence, continues to fascinate historians, filmmakers, and the public alike. The story of Al Capone is not just a tale of one man's rise and fall. It is a reflection of broader social, economic, and political forces that shaped early 20th century America. Nearly a century later, his life offers enduring lessons and insights into the dynamics of crime, power, and society, many of which remain strikingly relevant in today's world. At the heart of Capone's rise was Prohibition, a law designed to eliminate vice, but which instead created a thriving black market. By banning alcohol without addressing the demand for it, lawmakers inadvertently handed organized crime an unprecedented opportunity to expand. This dynamic is far from unique to the 1920s. Modern parallels can be found in the war on drugs, where prohibition of substances like marijuana, cocaine, and opioids has fueled underground economies, empowered cartels, and strained law enforcement resources. Capone's empire is a reminder that supply and demand cannot be legislated out of existence. When legitimate markets are closed, illicit ones often flourish in their place. Capone's success was built not just on violence or savvy business operations, but on corruption at every level of government. Police officers, judges, and politicians were routinely bribed, allowing the outfit to operate with near impunity. This lesson resonates today, as societies grapple with issues of systemic corruption, from corporate scandals to political bribery. Capone's story underscores how unchecked power erodes institutions, creating an environment where trust collapses and crime thrives. Capone was one of the first criminals to fully grasp the power of the media. By courting journalists and crafting a public persona as a businessman and benefactor, he blurred the line between notoriety and fame. This phenomenon is more visible than ever in the digital age, where social media can turn criminals, hackers, and scammers into cultural icons. The fascination with outlaw figures, from gang leaders to cybercriminals, reflects the same tension that made Capone so compelling: society's simultaneous condemnation and admiration of those who defy the rules. Capone's downfall is a reminder that empires built on fear and illegality are inherently unstable. His dominance lasted less than a decade, undone by a combination of relentless law enforcement pressure, public outrage, and his own hubris. Modern organizations, criminal or corporate, often face similar vulnerabilities. The higher the visibility, the greater the scrutiny, and the more fragile the foundation of power becomes when it is not built on legitimacy or sustainability. Capone's operations were in many ways a shadow economy that mirrored legitimate business practices. He understood the importance of supply chains, branding, and customer service long before these concepts became staples of business education. For economists and historians, Capone's empire serves as a case study in how markets adapt to regulation and how entrepreneurial skill can thrive in even the most hostile legal environments. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of Capone's life is the public's complex relationship with power and morality. His story endures not because of the specifics of his crimes, but because it taps into universal themes: ambition, rebellion, the desire for respect, and the ultimate cost of overreach. Modern audiences still consume stories about figures like Capone because they resonate on a human level. They remind us of both the heights that charisma and ambition can achieve and the depths to which they can descend when left unchecked.